This is one of my favorite Terence McKenna quotes. He's really hitting the nail on the head of what I was just talking about, artists creating the dream that can inspire the new world. In a way, it's the poets who have failed us because they have not provided a song or sung a vision that we could all move in concert to. So now we are in the absurd position of being able to do anything. And what we are doing is fouling our own nest and pushing ourselves towards planetary toxification and extinction. This is because the poets, the artists, have not articulated a moral vision. The moral vision must come from the unconscious. It doesn't have to do with these post movements in art, deconstructivism, this sort of thing. But art's task is to save the soul of mankind. And anything less is dithering while Rome burns. Because if the artists cannot find the way, then the way cannot be found.
Welcome back to the Mind Meld, my friends. And speaking of friends, my man James McCrae is back in the Mind Meld. And I am oh so glad he is. Because not only is he a blast to talk to, he's an author, poet, and the one and only meme sage that I'm aware of. And all of that culminates in a take that is both profound and playful. And if I may be so bold, I would say that's what this whole Mind Meld is, or at least aims toward, both the profound and the playful. Go see what I mean. Give James a follow on Instagram at Words Are Vibrations. The links to everything else he's doing are in the description as well. So with that, boop the like and sub for me if you haven't already. I know you're asked to do it constantly here on YouTube, but it really does help, particularly when we're in this infantile building stage. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to your podcasts. Links for all else TED, including our Patreon, are in the description as well. And with that, my friends, let's pass through the portal of this Mind Meld with my friend, the wise, whimsical James McCrae. You really are, I think, a unique voice in the sort of mystical meme poetry realm, in that there aren't many people who can continuously tickle me. It's sort of like, often when I see a meme, I feel like it's playing off of something that I've seen over and over again. And your takes are just always novel and always amusing. And that's not easy to be consistent on, man. So I always love riffing with you. I always love picking your brain. I always love getting a better idea of where these little transmissions are coming from. So stoked to talk again.
Thanks, bro. Happy to be here. I never set out to make memes, but I'm glad I started making them. And it's the meme format itself is such a ripe, creative platform for humor and sarcasm, and the ability to mix, poetry and esoteric wisdom and all kinds of interesting things with this sarcastic internet culture. So it's the most fun thing for me to do is just to make memes. It's just my that's my moment of zen.
Man, if it's fun, that is so important, because now that I'm in this daily creative grind, it has to be fun first and foremost, because there's always parts of the creative process that are a little bit painful. Like getting yourself, for me at least, getting myself to the table, getting myself to open the computer, getting myself to drop into that creative space. I grapple with the resistance on a daily basis. So if there isn't some just primary motivation, like it being fun, like it being inspiring, I don't think it's sustainable at all. It's got to come from a place of deep, almost yearning. And that makes it sound dramatic, but it's really what it feels like. And I mean, other than it being fun, does it scratch the itch for you of being meaningful in that way?
Honestly, as much as I can be a vessel for creativity, that's where I get all my meaning. Like I'm introverted by nature,
Hmm.
and just being in that creative space, and like if I can just look at my notebook or look at my files on my computer and see some sense of accomplishment, or like see some progress, or see some work that I'm happy with, that is, like, for me, that's the definition of fulfillment. Like, just like being a vessel for that creative energy. And I totally agree with you, it has to be fun. I just taught a course on branding and content creation, and that's one of the things I said. If you don't find a way to make it fun, you're not going to do it, and you're going to force it, and it's not going to be true. It's not going to feel um, just authentic and vulnerable. Because I used to, and I think every content creator, and in a way, like we're all content creators these days. Every content creator has their own style, has their own way of communicating, and it's all about finding the way that works for you. Like I used to think, like when I was, you know, when I published a book with Hay House, I used to think that like I had to be some like self help
Hmm.
style person. Like there's a template for what like a self-help Hay House author is, and I thought I had to kind of play that role, and I would try to make like little motivational YouTube videos, and I was trying, but like low key I hated it, and like I didn't have enthusiasm doing it, and it just didn't work. It didn't feel good. And then my first breakthrough in terms of like having fun with content creation was, I thought like, well, what really excites me? What do I like to do? Like what would I do for free just sitting around my house if no one ever even saw it? And I was like, oh, I like to draw and like doodle. Like that's like, it's just something I like doing. So my first memes were really like little doodles, like little like simple illustrations, and just like finding a way to communicate and to create content based on something that I just liked doing, and it was like effortless and something I didn't have to force myself to do. That was really the my first breakthrough, and I think memes are like an extension of that, like those little illustrations and doodles that I used to do. I'm just using found material rather than, generating something from scratch.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that when you combine what you would do naturally with what you find novel and entertaining and meaningful, if you can get that like three-part Venn diagram to overlap, it's like you're feeding your daimon or your genius or you're the keeper of your purpose a little nugget, because those are three really qualitative extensions, I think, of that, whatever that being is, whatever you want to call it. I like to use the word genius or daimon, as you know, in the sort of like Greek Roman James Hillman way. I mean, or you could just look at it really practically. Like, this is something I remember I was reading a positive psychology book a while ago. It might be by Martin Seligman, who's one of the psychologists who founded that movement. And that's one of the things he talks about right away in the book is, what would you do if no one made you do it? What would you pursue if no one made you do it? And that's a really powerful question to sit down and consider, because therein lies your path, right? Therein lies what you will feel fulfilled and you'll find entertaining to do. And no matter where you are in life, I think there's a way that you can readjust your calibration toward that question at least a couple degrees, and then over time that adjustment will pay dividends, and you'll find, oh, I was going this direction, and just by making these small changes I've completely shifted where I'm headed.
Yeah, I agree. I like to say that emotions are the compass, and
Yeah.
emotions are really the key to our purpose, because we try to over intellectualize life, right? And um, perceive the world through the lens of the intellect. And it's like, what should I be doing, and what can I do? And when it's all mental, I think that you're missing a key component, and that's the compass of your emotions, because we are naturally predisposed and inclined towards certain areas, and that's based on our love for doing them. And it's hard, our society obviously isn't set up to support people doing what they love, but there's always there are always ways to figure out how, if not as a profession, at least as a passion. And yeah, doing what you love is like the most simple way to find fulfillment in this life.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and what you just described right there is pretty close to that word that I use tongue in cheekly that you pointed out, that word technodharma. Like that pretty much is what I mean, is how do you use the tools that have collectively kind of consumed the human mind, and in a lot of ways have kind of enslaved and coerced the human mind in really unproductive, really unhealthy ways for a lot of people. How do you reorient your relationship with all of those things and sort of trick the system into working for you, into working for your daimon, for your purpose, for your soul? And I think that's the that nexus, that balancing point to me is the sort of technodharma. And if we can tip the scale person by person in that direction, I think we'll suddenly find that the underlying structure, the soil, the kind of substrate of why we're doing the things we do will begin to shift. And I want to believe that's where we're headed. I know people like you are trying to steer the ship that way. But when was the, because for you, I know, like, you know, you've openly talked about becoming a full-time creative after losing a day job and sort of being forced into figuring it out. And like you just said before, your first swing at it, you were successful in one way and that you got a book deal, but it sort of turned you into a person that you weren't. So, like, when did you finally feel like you dialed in that technodharmic frequency for yourself, for lack of a better term?
You know, for me, it was a an evolution that happened during quarantine. You know, when
Mm,
we were all the benefit of being in quarantine during 2020 was a forced introspection and a reprioritization and a reevaluation of our lives and um, our priorities. So I was also having kind of I was like a banging on a door that wasn't opening anymore. Like
mm,
this whole like self-help author door. Like it wasn't that path was just not responding. It was like the door was closed and it was like I was trying to like keep going down that path and it just wasn't there for me. And that's happened to me before in life, you know, where like you're on a trajectory and you think you're going to keep going down this trajectory, and then maybe suddenly the door closes and you're like trying to bang on the door because you still think that's my trajectory. I need to keep going down this path. But when that door closes, it's actually an opportunity to find a new trajectory. And you need to let go of the parts of yourself that are no longer part of your new path. So I really had to essentially rethink my identity, rethink who I was in the world, and essentially go through a death and a rebirth.
hmm.
And I think it's just so important for especially artists, but really everyone to go through these deaths and rebirths to reinvent themselves. You know, if you look at artists like Pablo Picasso or Bob Dylan, like they were constantly like killing off the old version of themselves so that they could start a new period of their work. And that's true in our lives as well. You know, like how many people these days change careers? Lots of people. And I think that's beautiful because I think that everything is just like a ship that carries us across the water to the next land, and you don't have to, you know, pick up that ship and keep carrying it. Once you reach the island, you're there and you can kind of explore something new now. So for me it was just I really had to like intentionally let my old identity die, which is painful and there is uncertainty in doing that. But unless you do that, you're just going to feel stuck, and you're going to feel like you're pounding on a door that's just not opening. So I like to
Yeah.
say, if it doesn't open, it's not your door. It's not rejection. It's divine redirection.
I love that. I love that. Did you feel, could you tap in to, where I think everybody listening wants to believe they would be able to zoom out and think abundantly and think, oh, this just isn't my path, but there's so many other paths. I can make a door here. I can go through this door. I can try that door. Were you able to tap into that right away, or did it feel like, the opposite, where you're shrinking in, you're getting a little bit of like existential claustrophobia, feeling like, well, my little 15 minutes are over, I don't know what the fuck I'm going to do now? Did you have like a dark night of the soul, or were you able to be like, to just sort of judo that energy in another direction without panicking?
I think there was a dark night of the soul at first because this transition began when I was still living in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So like New York City as a whole entire entity was kind of like a closed door for me at that time.
Mm.
So like a lot of things were like closed doors. So I did have a little bit of an existential crisis during that period, but coming out of it, all that it ended up being was sinking into my nature. It's like stop struggling, stop trying, stop forcing, simply sink into your nature. And regardless of what that means of other people's expectations of you and your expectations for yourself, because a lot of these are mental constructs, right? When you sink into your nature, it's no longer a mental construct. It's like a felt, embodied knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that was really returning to owning the identity of being an artist, something that I identified with when I was younger. But then I get swept away in my career and, all these other things. And art, it was like creativity is still a part of it, but it's like, no, like I'm actually like an artist first. And like just like owning that, like allowing myself to be, oh, I'm an artist first. Cause so many people, it's so hard to claim that they're an artist. I felt the same way. Like, well, I am an artist. Technically, I make art, but like to introduce yourself as an artist, that's
Mm-hmm.
hard to
Mm-hmm.
do because it's like, what does that mean? It's like, oh, so you like,
Yeah.
so you're poor, or like what, or you paint, and it's like I don't paint. So just like finding my own definition for what it means to be an artist and interpreting that in my own way and letting myself find my own style, that was all a residual effect of just like sinking into my nature and just like really owning um the dreams I had when I was a kid, and like returning back to that like childhood, like um feeling and
Yeah.
destiny that kids have.
So practically, I love that. I mean, I love that answer for sure. And I agree with that answer wholeheartedly. But I think a lot of people might listen to that and be like, what does that mean? Sink into my nature. Like what did it mean for you practically when you were having this feeling of shit, these doors are closed and I want to just get back to being me. I want to get back in touch with that, like you pointed to, that childlike creative impulse that used to just wash over me naturally as a kid. Like what did that mean for you? What did you start doing? What did you change?
I'll tell you the most fundamental thing that I did, and that's uh, I began writing poetry again
Hmm.
because I was always a writer, and I've written during every phase of my life, but what I've written always changes. So I started writing poetry at like the age of 14, and I feel like I wrote like almost a poem a day up until I was in my early 20s. So like during all through high school, I was writing poetry often. And then when I got swept up in the advertising industry, I kept writing. For a while, I had a blog about branding and design. I wrote a book, Shit Your Ego Says.
Mm-hmm.
But I really, so I was writing, instructional things like, interesting things, but I wasn't writing poetry. And not that I even write a lot of poetry now, but it was really for me, that was a huge reconnection to go back in that space, because poetry is a language of subtlety and in a way uncertainty. we're also society is so conditioned to like make you think you need to have the answers and like to present this argument. Like you're in the YouTube world, right? Like every YouTuber is like you have to have
Yeah.
like um my perspective. This is my take. My
Right.
and the hot you want to have the hottest take,
And that's
right?
why I'm not a successful YouTuber, probably. That's probably why.
And Twitter is like, what's the hottest take? What's the most
Right.
like cutting take? Like you need to like have an opinion and like this is my opinion. And that's the stuff that like on like tends to go viral. But like poetry is the opposite of that. Poetry is the absence of a take. It
Mm.
is it is living in that place of wonder and
Yeah.
curiosity and subtlety. And this is related to mythology as well. It's like it's non-literal truths.
Right.
So it's like you're pointing your finger at something that language cannot even describe.
Yeah. Yeah. You're
And
like
you're
capturing. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
no.
I was going to say it's
So
like you're capturing an archetype, and by that I mean something that is innately true about the human experience in an immortal way through a narrative structure. You're not capturing an empirically true narrative, but you're capturing something that as soon as people read it, it just resonates, and it has this animating effect where people just viscerally say, "Yes, I get this. I understand this." And I think, in a way, I think that's truer than empirical truth. And when I say truer, I don't mean like, yeah, I get that you're not going to cure cancer with that kind of truth, but you're going to bring meaning to your own life with that kind of truth, you know? And to me, that's as important as it gets.
yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the Tao Te Ching is the Tao that can be named is not the true
Yeah.
Tao. And I see that meaning once you try too hard to define truth, I think you it slips through your fingers. Truth
Yeah.
is very elusive, and is language is so interesting because language gives us the ability to communicate, and language is such a powerful tool, but it's also inherently limiting because we can only express what we have the language to express. And there's something inherently binary about language as well. Like it's this
Yeah.
or it's not this. And sometimes, every perspective is true from that perspective. Like I often think of quote unquote reality as imagine a disco ball and you've got all the different little mirrors that circle
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
entire 360-degree surface of this ball. Each of those mirrors is one little perspective, one little human vantage point looking out into the world. And that vantage point is true from that perspective. There's another vantage point on the other end of the ball that is also true from that perspective. So when you're fighting over which vantage point is most true, you're missing the larger truth of it being a disco ball with hundreds, or in our case of humans, billions
Yeah. Yeah.
of little vantage points. So poetry for me is a way to transcend the little vantage point and start to hint at the greater whole that language only begins to express.
Yeah. Absolutely. And on that line too that you mentioned, the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. I think that's the opening line of the whole book.
It's on the first
And
page for sure.
and by putting it at the beginning like that, in a way, I feel like it's sort of functioning as, I'm about to spit some shit and I'm going to do my best to really try to capture this wisdom, but all of it's fundamentally flawed. And you need to try to see behind what I'm saying. You need to feel behind what I'm saying to get even close to understanding the real transcendent truth. Like, so it's almost like a reminder not to get hung up on the words and try to, not get hung up on the all of these different lenses we use and maps we use, you know, in a map is not the territory kind of way, and always try to like follow that spirit subjectively from your own heart first. And that's like the sign of a true sage, is to be like, yeah, I'm about to try to talk about this transcendent thing, but at the end of the day, everything I'm saying is going to be also limited and flawed.
Yeah, I love that he's putting a disclaimer
Right.
on the project. I have the perfect thing to read for this. I've never posted this, but I keep meaning to. This is this is a disclaimer. So like the idea is, because people on social media, especially, people always misinterpret people's posts and they jump to
Right.
conclusions, and that's why we have so much chaotic social media discourse. So this was my idea to put as a with every single thing I posted, I'm going to put this in the caption, and it says, disclaimer: this post does not represent a definitive truth. Everything depends on context and perspective. There is one way to look at this is one way to look at this particular topic, but not the only way. There is endless nuance in every idea. Language, especially a single meme, fails to capture it all. This post represents a snapshot of my perspective at this particular time. This perspective is subject to change. Next year or next week, I'll probably have a slightly different opinion based on new life experiences. After all, I'm a human being in a constant state of changing and growing. Thank you for your patience as we both learn to communicate our version of reality while seeking to understand where the other is coming from.
Yeah, I like the thank you for your patience part. It makes me
Someone's going to
feel
put
like,
that on every
yeah,
single post from now on. Is just like a disclaimer.
yeah. You should also give it its own post and be like, this is what I'm going to start putting.
That
Um,
was the idea. That was the
there's
idea.
there's like a key piece of nuance in there that I'm curious about your perspective on, which is clearly everything you said there is undeniable. Like, in that we do have this very limited perspective. Truth is elusive. Our even the ability that we have to try to capture truth with any of our given tool sets is limited and contextual. But the key piece of nuance I'm curious about from your perspective is that sounds like a sort of postmodernist take, in that truth is relative. Like, we've kind of gone past all these different ways of looking at the world, and now we get to sit here and be like, oh, it's all relative. Or is it just relative from our perspective, and there really is a transcendent truth? It's just that we are going to fail at every turn to try to capture that truth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're tapping into some interesting territory, because that is an epic question, and that question is in a lot of ways at the heart of the cultural crisis that we're living through right
Yeah.
now. Because I love to think about like the history of mythology, and it's so easy to forget that, and it's not taught to us in our schools, that mythology is the bedrock of civilization.
Yeah.
Like mythology is that kind of unifying truth that ties a culture together. And that could be anything. It's usually based on some kind of a religious myth, whether that's the Greek gods, or in the case of our society, Christianity. And this isn't to say that, you know, any god is true or not true, but there was this idea of a unifying belief, a unifying truth that everyone could get behind and agree to. And without that fabric, that
Yeah.
social fabric, we can't really have a functioning society, because I think a country's laws, values, and culture are residual from its mythology.
Right.
And I really think that part of the reason we're in this meta crisis that we're in now, and when I say meta crisis, I mean, if you look around, there's a crisis with multiple nexus points: an economic crisis, a political crisis, a culture warfare,
Yeah.
economic crisis. And I think all of these ladder up to this spiritual crisis, and it's because we've lost a connection to shared truth and to a shared belief system
Yeah.
that really holds a society together. And that, our society, the mythology has been Christianity, and I'm not making any value statements about Christianity, but as a as a Western civilization, it no longer has the potency of its mythology. I think it's Nietzsche predicted this in the 1880s when he said God is dead. Well, what did Nietzsche mean when he said God is dead? He didn't mean that there was a God in the sky that passed away and now we're all alone. What he meant was we as a humanity have turned our attention and our awareness away from this shared idea of God or of one universal truth that was at that time based on Christian principles. And he was saying this in the 1880s, that we have killed God by essentially looking away from that belief, and
Yeah.
that's even more pronounced in 2022.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways we're just swimming in the wreckage of the death of God. And what's funny is, in a way, through the destruction of God, quote unquote, I believe we can, it allows us actually to approach closer to God in a sort of paradoxical way, because in the sort of Joseph Campbellian way, in the sort of mythological way, the final step to actually having a mystical experience is destroying your idea of God, is like taking all the masks of God you're aware of and just like destroying them. Because in conditioning it with an idea, you're simplifying it, you're turning it into something that it's not. And instead of doing that, we've destroyed all the ideas of God and come to the conclusion of, so there is no God. But that's, in my opinion, that's not what it means. It actually means that all ideas of God are limited, but they also probably hold some kernel of truth as to the nature of that being. Like Christianity, I mean, man, the core story or myth, if you want to call it that, at the heart is God came to earth just to give the message of, no matter what you do, I forgive you, and you can return back to the unity of the cosmic mind, or whatever you want, nous, nous, whatever. And could you think of a more beautiful myth than that? Could you think of a more beautiful unifying principle than that? But at the same time, it feels like people's turning away from that myth also means that they're seeking something more. And now that I think about it, it may not be that that myth is failing as much as people are not able to connect with it anymore, or the dogma they've wrapped around the core of it has degraded the potency of it, or something like that. And paradoxically, I think that when you get back in touch with the creative spirit in the way that we've been talking about, through being a creator, through being an artist, you sort of rediscover the core wonder that we all have access to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's really an interesting place to be, where it's, it, and again, I'm not making any value judgments about the Christian faith, but there's been a lot of failure in that institution that have led to the distrust of it. All of the wars, all of the stuff the Catholic Church has been up to for centuries.
Yeah.
It's there's a reason people have turned their back on it. But the question is, what are we replacing it with? You can't
Right.
you cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater. And like, because if you, and this is what Jordan Peterson always talks about, right? Once you throw out the prevailing myths that hold a
Yeah.
society together, what is holding that society together? Nothing other than authoritarian control,
Yeah.
right? So it's a culture without myth is a very dangerous place to be. And you mentioned postmodernism, and that's really where we are right now. The prevailing mythology or philosophy that is taught in universities today and is the barometer by which art and literature are evaluated is postmodernism, which is by definition an unraveling of grand narratives, i.e.
Yeah.
myths, like exactly the kind of connective tissue that mythology and religion provide. Postmodernism is a systematic deconstruction of these into a place of pure relativity where every
Right.
vantage point is equal. And so this is good and bad, right? Because I think it's good in a way, because I think of it as a way of wiping the slate clean and
Yeah.
erasing all of the superstitions and illusions and corruption that have resulted from the decaying myth that we had and have, right? But again, what does it replace it with?
Right.
Deconstructivism alone does not a culture make. So
Absolutely.
so now
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
see we're all living in our own disconnected reality bubbles, and we are united only by our shared outrage and confusion.
Right. Right. And what's funny is I've heard a lot of blowback recently from this idea that universities are really pushing the postmodern, sometimes Marxist sort of point of view. I graduated from college more than 10 years ago, and I have a journalism degree. And particularly when I started to go through the media studies side of things, that was 100% the undertone of all of it. Like, and by the way, here's the caveat to that. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the idea of reducing things down to their cultural components and trying to look at them like a scholar and understand that all of it is kind of relative in a way. But I don't land on that being the truth. I land on that being a new perspective that's available to us now. And I take that lesson as being so everything is iterative, and we still should value the transcendent universals that culture originally aspired to attain, like justice, like equality, like all of these different things that people objectively would still be like, yeah, we need justice, we need opportunity, we need these things. Like, we can be iterative about it, and we shouldn't worship the structure, but we also shouldn't just destroy the structure because everything's relative. Like, that's a really, I think, childish approach.
Right. So I think we're going through a bit of a portal where, because I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle,
No.
right? That's why the whole like "Make America Great" a thing is like based on a fallacy of
Totally.
returning to the past. Like, you can't return to the past. You can only go forward, and you can only adjust and adapt things to influence the future. So when I look at how to fix this meta crisis, it's really a daunting task,
Yeah.
right? Because we're talking about deeply systemic problems um, that are causing great imbalance and pain in the world. So, what can we as individuals
Yeah. Yeah.
do to fix systemic problems? And I think, especially as like an artist or as a creative, right? So, I think that everyone has a role in society, and everyone has a different role, and everyone has an important role. There are a lot of people who are builders, who are going to actually like build the new systems. But what systems are they going to build? They need a plan first. So we need planners. We need people to actually like put together a plan and to strategize. But what is the vision that is being planned and strategized? And that comes from the imagination, that comes from a dream. And only the artists and only the poets can supply a dream worth believing in.
Yeah.
So I think that my answer to the crisis that I'm seeing from my vantage point is that it is the responsibility of the artists to dream a new dream. So the planners can take it and plan it, and the builders can take the plan and build it. So I think that the artists need to find a way to collectively create a new myth worth believing in. Something that is once we can only unite in the physical world once we have united in the mind, in the
Mm,
imagination.
mm.
Like look at how like an art like the Beatles, for example, could bring an entire country together, or all of Western civilization essentially like got behind the vision of the Beatles. That's just like one example of how art can be a unifying force that can propel social change.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's, tapping into the McCrae philosophy a bit. I think that the lead really, as you have already pointed out, is the feeling. Not worrying so much about like well, what does that mean? What is that myth? What is that story? I don't think it's as much of a story as it is people feeling it in the way that you were describing, that you try to tap into your own feelings first and foremost before you start playing with ideas, before you start like putting words on paper. Last time we did a podcast, you told me that you tap into your body, you tap into the way you're feeling, and you let that sort of steer. And I think people are so disconnected from that spirit that they have innately, that's talking to them through emotion, that's talking to them through different impulses, that that's really the cool, like, and believing, and maybe this is where the myth starts to come in, like believing that that is an intelligence, believing that that's maybe a being, if you like a daimon or a genius, that's in a dialogue with you at all times. That right there, just taking that seriously, holy shit, does that shift things, like, oh, there's a
Hmm.
part of me or a being attached to me that's trying to steer. It's not just like my psyche, my mind, neuroses or whatever. It's like, no, that's an intelligence that is talking to you right now, and it's telling you what to do through your emotions, through your body, through your intuition.
Yes. Yes, I truly believe there is a new world that wants to be born,
Yeah.
and it can only be born through us. So we need to listen. Like, put down the ego. Like, we don't know, I don't know the way. Like, intelligence is highly overrated. I mean, intelligence is obviously very important, but like the human brain, the intelligence of the human brain is only so great. Like, you saw the meme I posted yesterday with like it was like a giant
Yeah,
package
yeah, I loved
that
it.
was
Yeah.
being delivered into this tiny little mailbox. And the package, I labeled it as like, this is the vision, this is the message from God I received during psychedelics, during a
Yeah, yeah.
heroic
Yeah, yeah,
dose.
yeah.
And the tiny mailbox was like my human brain trying to process it the next morning.
Yep.
Like, the human brain is extremely limited in its understanding. So like, we need to have some humility, some intellectual humility, to allow space for things that cannot be logically understood.
1,000%, man.
But
And
I
what's
have a couple.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a couple of great quotes to read, if I may.
Of course.
This is one of my favorite Terence McKenna quotes, and it's a little long, but he's really hitting the nail on the head of what I was just talking about. Artists creating the dream that can inspire the new world. So this is from a talk that McKenna gave in the early '90s about creativity. In a way, it's the poets who have failed us, because they have not provided a song or sung a vision that we could all move in concert to. So now we are in the absurd position of being able to do anything. And what we are doing is fouling our own nest and pushing ourselves towards planetary toxification and extinction. This is because the poets, the artists, have not articulated a moral vision. The moral vision must come from the unconscious. It doesn't have to do with these post movements in art, deconstructivism, this sort of thing. But art's task is to save the soul of mankind, and anything less is dithering while Rome burns. Because if the artists cannot find the way, then the way cannot be found.
Yeah. I know that one, and the fact that he spits that kind of stuff off the top of his head is just like he's like the greatest freestyle rapper, except he's just also he's not just rhyming, he's like channeling the muse or something
Yeah,
through his mouth. Like I love when he's on rants like that. Sometimes you'll hear the crowd laughing
yeah.
because you just know that like he is just melting everyone's minds with this thing we use on a daily basis, from the most mundane trip to the grocery store to a transcendent talk like that, it called the English language. And he's just he's like the equivalent of like an Olympic gymnast with the English language, you know?
Oh yeah, and he was
Yeah.
the best podcast guest ever before
Yeah.
podcasts existed.
Yeah. We're
This
gonna
is
have
another
to.
quote, but this is another quote that I think is like very similar in meaning, and this one's from Plato.
Oh yeah, let's go.
And this is actually in the Republic. And I just discovered this quote recently, and like I've just completely fell in love with it. And it's saying in essence the same thing that McKenna was saying. So this is Plato. He's talking about music in particular. Musical innovation is full of danger to the state. For when the modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state always change with them. That quote knocked me off of my feet, because here's Plato in the book that is the source book for all of Western philosophy, and he's saying that when the styles of music inside of a culture change, it's only a matter of time until the fundamental laws of that culture change also.
Yeah.
That's the power, that that's the unifying vision. There's a new style of music that people can kind of connect to. And
Mhm.
like here's an example, rock and roll music. So I love studying, the history of art and music. And I think rock and roll is such an interesting genre because before rock and roll in American music, you had two streams, and they did not touch. And the easiest way to describe them were white music and black music. White music was kind of grew up in the Appalachian area, and it was based on European folk music and ballads and like a lot of Irish limerick stuff. And then it kind of, this is where like the roots of country music. And they
Mhm.
actually
Mhm.
called it, like the term for it in like the 30s and 40s was hillbilly music. That's what they called it. And then you had black music. And this is based on, I mean, it goes back to Africa, obviously. And they brought, African songs with them when they came to America, and they would preserve them, but then they would also integrate them with, like voodoo is. I actually love the voodoo tradition, and what it actually is it's African religions that were hidden under the guise of Catholicism, so
Mm.
they could kind of do it in open without it being like forbidden. So it's kind of like this way of like sneaking in the African spirituality. And then through voodoo, there was new songs and new music. And this is kind of where the blues comes from. This is where jazz comes from. And again, in the 30s and 40s, they actually called this race music. So you
Mm.
had hillbilly music and you had race music. These were the technical terms that record labels used to assign these. And again, they were very separate. Rock and roll was the first genre of music that just put them together. Rock and roll is the blues tradition meets the country music tradition, and you put them together, and suddenly you have this explosion of creativity and culture, and you have the whole rock and roll revolution. And that was really, in my view, that's like the first stage of of racial integration.
Yeah.
Like the music had to unite before the people could unite.
Yeah.
This is the power of the imagination. This is the power of music. This is the power of creativity. So like
Yeah.
rock and roll was a myth, and you could say rock and roll was a myth. It was like this concept of this merging of cultures, and it didn't happen overnight, but fast forward a few years, you've got the civil rights movement. You've got more, cultural integration, and it's not perfect, but like you can see it got the ball rolling. So this is how impactful art can be when it's serving a purpose.
Yeah. And that's another really interesting example of the myth that I talk about all the time, of the myth of Hermes or Mercury obliterating a boundary and alchemically merging two things in a way that they never were before, because there was this clear boundary. And this is that cattle stealing myth of like Hermes turning himself into a god through offending the gods first, breaking down the structure, offending the structure, insulting the structure, and then somehow finding himself as a member of Olympus after that. It's like it's this disruptive spirit that always finds a way to transcend the boundary, to breach the boundary, and reform a new structure. And that's a really cool example of that I've never actually thought about.
Yeah, so I think there's so many lessons in history and in art history, and so I want to pivot into, because I think that I'm kind of, what we're talking about is like, oh, go out and create a new myth, right? And that's like that's a daunting thing to do. It's like, where
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
start? Where do you even start? So I want to drop some like breadcrumbs into areas that artists and creatives and podcasters and people of all sorts can pursue, to get us closer to kind of a unifying social fabric. And I'm going to tap back into Terence, because I love Terence,
Yeah,
and
of
he
course.
really was an inspirational figure as I was connecting these dots. So Terence McKenna introduced an idea called the archaic revival.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's kind of the premise of that. He said that when a culture gets into trouble, what it does is it instinctively goes back through its own past until it finds a moment when things seem to make sense. And then it brings that moment forward into the present. So here's an example of that: the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were not a very fun time in human history. The Roman Empire had collapsed. It was a time of great famine and plagues, and the heavy-handed rule of the Roman Catholic Church, witch hunts. It was by definition a very bad time in human history. They call it the Dark Ages for a reason. So, how did we get out of the Dark Ages? How did we progress out? It was the artists and the philosophers who did what McKenna said. They looked back into history to the last time that kind of intrinsically made sense. And for the people in the Dark Ages, it was the classical period of ancient Greece,
Mm-hmm.
because this was the birth of philosophy, the birth of democracy. It was a flourishing period for the arts, for culture. So what they did is they resurrected the principles of ancient Greece, and they applied them to the present moment. And that is what gave birth to the Renaissance. It was the resurrection of old principles and myths from ancient times that they could apply to the present. And this is where Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and the Enlightenment philosophers all came from, was this like resurrecting the lost knowledge of the classical period.
Yeah.
So this is what McKenna said about our period in time. He said, we must now reach back into time for a new cultural model. Our crisis is so great that we have to reach back to the high Paleolithic, to the moment immediately before the invention of agriculture and the creation of the dominator ego.
Wow.
So I think that the moment in human history, I think this was roughly 10,000 years ago, when people went from being hunter gatherers to being to the birth of agriculture. This was a huge leap in human history, and it's a mixed bag of good and bad. Like on the surface, it's like, oh, well, that's great, because when you have agriculture, you can plant food, you can stay in one place, you can build a town, you can build a city, you can store food. It sounds pretty good on the surface, and there's a lot good about it. But what it also did is it gave people the ability to hoard resources
Right.
and to own land. So McKenna and a lot of other people have pointed to the invention of agriculture as a key moment where it did give us a lot of technological advances, but it was a key moment in the severing of humanity from spirit.
Yeah, and from our place in nature just in general.
Exactly. So McKenna is theorizing that in order to, because back to the meta crisis, this like dominator, McKenna called it the dominator ego society.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we live under. And things like the patriarchy, colonialism.
The dominator culture.
So yeah, I don't even try because I can't do it. But things like patriarchy and colonialism and white supremacy, these are all effects of this. It's a greater crisis that transcends race and nation, right? It's the human ego, right? And a lot of people have pointed to the beginning of agriculture as the beginning of this dominator ego. So McKenna was theorizing that in order to move past it, we need to go back in time to before it existed, the same way that the people in the Dark Ages went back into ancient Greece to pull out the principles to bring into the present. We need to go back before agriculture and bring up the principles of that time and resurrect them in our present moment. And that's the only way to heal the current divide and create a vision and a dream that we can all buy into.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense to me, because if you look at what those cultures were all obsessed with, what they were dedicating their time and their energy to doing was making these like megalithic structures that were in worship of the cosmos and gods and archetypes and everything. I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say, I don't think we need to be anthropologists to say that if a culture is spending a disproportionate amount of energy on that kind of activity, that's probably what their whole society was structured around. And then you have this central sacred point on earth from which your whole culture emanates. You have your central pyramid, your central whatever, and then everything emanates out from that. And I think now perhaps we're in a place where we don't build a physical structure. We again need to repurpose our highest level of innovation, which now is this like emerging digital psychic realm. And what if that was our megalith, man? What if our megalith is this technodharmic place? This I guess would be like a fourth dimensional non-local place of consciousness that we can all access. And I mean, I know this is highly ideal, but what if we could all agree that this space has to be a sacred space, and that we don't go, what do you not do in a sacred space? You don't disrespect it. You don't spit on the ground. You don't put your psychic sharts into the digital ether in the form of assaulting other people online. Like, what if we just had like 10 commandments of the internet or something, and they didn't have to be monolithically enforced in like a freedom of speech kind of way? We just all agreed on it because namaste. I look at you, I see you as a human being, I respect you. Like, wouldn't that be something?
I love that. I love the idea first of all is like what if the new myth is just actually comes from AI?
Yeah, we let the AI be like, just give it all of Hermes trace, like train it off of Hermes Trismegistus and Terence McKenna and all of the sages of the past, and let it make the rules.
But
I bet it
no,
would come up with a lot better shit than yeah.
we don't feed it anything. Like it tells us.
Hmm.
The AI is getting crazy, man. Have you seen the new headshots that it's creating from people?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's getting really crazy. But no, but I do love the idea of let's just all agree that it's a sacred place. Like that's the simplest, like most common sense rule. Like, you guys, like go do whatever you want, but like everything, just remember everything is sacred. Like that's the one rule. And I love the building that kind of idea into the internet. No one thinks about that. We think about sacred spaces, and it might be a church or a temple or a meditation center, whatever it is. But like, how can building in the idea of sacredness into the technology, into the internet, that is so crucial. I think there
Yeah.
was someone who wrote like the internet declaration of independence like back in the mid 90s, and this document exists. I haven't read it, but I think it like there have been attempts at that to kind of create like the laws or the more like the rights of people within the
Mm-hmm.
internet space. But I really do think,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm you know me, I'm a big believer in technology. And I think that in a lot of ways, because I love nature as well, right? And I think we need a balance of both. And I think that when we look back at the pre-agriculture civilization, it was connection to nature was built into the fabric of the society. Like nature is maybe just nature is the myth. Like nature is the myth. Like look
Mm.
at look to nature. Nature is wise beyond our understanding. So we have so much to learn from nature, and we need to deepen our connection to nature. I do not think that is necessarily in contrast to also exploring technology.
Mm-hmm.
I see the future as being highly technological and also highly natural, and having a symbiosis between these things where we honor, and I think that actually we can do that, because if the more and more of the more our world becomes digitized, it actually can lessen the strain that we're putting on the earth by, you know, d- tearing apart the earth for minerals and resources. And I know we need minerals and resources to create technology, but the more that we can do in the imagination, like, and connect digitally or in some type of metaverse thing,
Yeah.
that's less, it could be less, flights, it could be less building buildings. I think
True.
you can actually lessen the strain on the ecosystem by leaning further into technology.
Well, what's interesting is I think you're starting to see this slowly happen on a meta level physically, because what's the primary measure of that? It's how many humans are there. And we're actually slowly decreasing the number of humans on the planet. Like most people think we're having a population explosion, but like most industrialized, high GDP nations are actually going through a population decline. And this is viewed by a lot of people as a not good thing, because it's going to contribute to lower GDP and economic output, right? Like, for instance, Japan is very afraid of this because their population, I think, is probably around 150 million, and they're projected to go under 100 million within the next couple of decades or something, which in a way, like, yeah, that's cataclysmic for GDP. But what if we weren't measuring wellness by GDP? Because clearly GDP does not equal wellness. If it did, we would not be at record high suicide levels and, mental illness levels and diseases of what's that phrase? Diseases of
Of convenience.
Close. It's close. It's close. Affluence.
Right, 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 right,
Diseases of
right.
affluence. There we go. I'm going to edit it to make it sound like I'm very smart. And
Hmm.
if we really, I think that's ultimately what it's going to come down to, man, is we have to have a wellness currency above a currency of physical wealth. Like, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of that. And I think that it works pretty well, like being able to achieve and do well for yourself through your hard work. On its face, that's not a bad thing. But when you do that off the back of human suffering, and that's fine because the ends justify the means, that's not okay. And that's how we've wound up where we are. And we've got to change that. We've got to find a way to change that. And back to the idea of making digital space sacred. If there was the amount of litter, of psychic litter that is in the digital space right now in physical space, I think the whole fucking world would be a landfill. I think you'd just be walking through trash every time you went down the street. Because think about like the vast majority, like Twitter's the best example. It's like the vast majority of Twitter is the equivalent of verbal litter, And that's got to change, man.
Yes.
I don't think it's going to change, but
Well, Elon Musk has an interesting approach because are you following the Elon Musk Twitter takeover?
yeah, more or less.
It's his strategy seems to be. I really do believe that he is trying to make a free speech platform, but it's rubbing people the wrong way because his belief, and I want to believe this can work this way, is to let it all out. To let it all be said, to let it all be heard. Not everything, not like, people always jump to the worst scenario, like threats of violence and things like
Right.
that. No, that's illegal. That's not allowed. But differing political opinions. So on the surface, if you let everything out, it does create in the short term a lot more chaos. Like imagine if someone has been repressed their entire lives, never say what's on their mind, and then they're like finally allowed to, like that might trigger a rather violent outburst of some sort because it's been suppressed for so long. So I think that when you truly allow there to be like a free speech platform, you might get a lot of chaos because the social discourse will immediately combust into a lot of argumentative back and forth. But the idea is that once that initial explosion of chaos subsides, maybe the fact that we all felt like we were able to express ourselves and be heard and be allowed to speak, maybe in the long term, that kind of settles everyone down because we can at least see where everyone's at. No one's hiding, no one's suppressing. Because I really think, I host a monthly open mic night here in Austin, and I think that expression is such an important modality for healing. Like to stand up in front of a group, to read a poem, to sing a song, to be vulnerable, to share a part of yourself that you don't usually share. It is such a cathartic experience, both for the sharers and the receivers of those words. So letting it out, letting it be expressed, I think has the potential to kind of calm everyone down. But I know I like what you said about all the litter of Twitter comments. I would love to see a world where everyone walked up to people in real life and said the things that they're commenting on people's posts. You know what I mean? Because I did a post, I did a video on this where it was like, we need to talk about internet manners, because people are out here saying things online that they would never dream of saying in real life.
100%. Yeah.
and I guess it's wild. Maybe it's good because they get it again. They get to express their true feelings, and like when you lift up the rock, and you're gonna see a bunch of bugs crawling around, right? Like you're bringing light to something. So I
What's
guess it
funny?
could be good in the long term just to allow there to be like some open and free expression.
I would love to believe that, but I think the thing is people's truths, quote unquote, are so contextual, almost like in the same way we were talking about, where I remember talking to a friend of mine, Shane Moss, who's a comedian, about this, how if you looked at what he posted on Twitter versus what he posts on Instagram versus what he says on his podcast, it would almost be like you're looking at three different people, because the platforms themselves are so contextually coercive that I don't know if it really is people's truths. It's how they feel that they're going to gain social capital in that environment. And it's like, oh, this is, this is my, like you were saying before, like maybe Twitter is the hot take platform and that works well for me. So that's my technique now. That's what this platform is. And yeah, dude, it's so complicated. I think the digital anonymity is part of it. I think the lack of, any repercussions whatsoever is a huge part of it. And I don't know how you build that accountability and that sense of personal responsibility into a realm where you can hide your face and all the other parts of yourself. And yeah, that's a huge part of making it
Yeah.
sacred, is how do you tie it back to who you really are, and what really matters. And I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. And I guess another thing that, Elon is, professing to do, and I'm not like the biggest Elon stan. Like, I think there's a lot of good things about him.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of questionable things about him. He's a very polarizing figure. I'm not making one, um, I'm not jumping to any particular side. I'm just kind of like watching it
same.
unfold. But another thing that he has claimed to want to do in terms of this anonymity thing is, well, first of all, getting rid of the bots. And that's great because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of chaos that are bots are just it's weaponized
Yeah.
information propaganda. Then it happens all over on every side of every issue from our own government as well as foreign agents. Bots are a really big problem. But also, okay, it's this whole thing. He wants to verify every account to make it so you have to pay $8 a month to be verified. And if you're not verified, you can have a Twitter, but you're basically no one's going to see your stuff. Like it's kind of like the
Watching that whole thing blow up was highly entertaining, by the way.
it was highly entertaining. They had a lot of because I love it though because he's like changing the platform in real time and
Yeah, just like,
experimenting with
whoops, that
it.
didn't work.
Like I just love that like it's true startup culture. Like let's just like literally change the whole platform in this way based on a whim. But I think you need to try things to see how they work and adjust rather than hold back. And nothing's perfect. I think you need to like you learn by doing. So that's
Yes.
kind of what I see him doing. But this, I think his vision, and this don't get me wrong, this is scary too. There's a good side of this and there's a bad side of this. The good side of this is that everyone will have no one can hide behind an anonymous account. You have to be verified and it's connected to your identity. And it's like it's more of like it's almost like a digital ID where it's like you have to be like officially like you. Um and that kind of holds people accountable and it proves that they're real people. That that's kind of the good side. The bad side is that it's a digital ID and that it starts to like feed into the fears around like a social credit system based on your Twitter
Yeah.
profile that um that's connected to your banking information and all of these things. So there are positive outcomes and there are negative outcomes, but it's interesting to see how some of these issues are being attempted to be solved right now.
Totally, man. It's so nuanced because it's like, on we know it can work because in your gatherings it works. Everyone's nice, everyone's vulnerable, everyone comes in with their guard down. They're there for real, transparent reasons, for community, for expression, for all of these beautiful things. Same with my Patreon patrons. They're all fucking awesome. They're all there for the right reasons. But then as soon as you scale it, as soon as it becomes impersonal, as soon as you get beyond like a certain number of people, shit just seems to go awry. And I don't know. I don't know, man. I don't know how you can scale it without some kind of, maybe we do need some kind of AI like council that can just counsel everybody, a council that counsels the collective. I'll just leave it at I've stumbled upon alliteration, so it must be true.
I think that it's going to work itself out because I think that we are in the process of a collective consciousness evolution.
Hmm.
That sounds a little woo woo, and I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that I'm seeing it. I know the changes. I can only speak from personal experience, right? I know the changes that I've experienced in the past 10 years, and they're dramatic. And the evolution of my own consciousness, which has been facilitated by multiple things, anything from psychedelics to meditation to studying religions and exploring creativity and going deeper into my own feelings and um,
Yeah.
emotions, and all of this like has led to a complete blossoming of my own consciousness. And not only have I seen that in myself, I've seen that in so many people I know, yourself included, so many friends that I have today. We have gone through an initiation into just like a more subtle understanding,
Yeah.
a more subtle kind of expansive consciousness that can, it's not like it's beyond duality, but it's at least like has a flavor of beyond duality, where it's like we can kind of see the issues from a higher perspective and see, you know rise above the bickering at the dinner table to find some kind of like truth that we can all agree upon together. So I've seen
Yeah.
it enough in my own life and in the lives of people I know where I know it's possible. And I like to think, I like to be an early adopter, an innovator, and maybe we've arrived at this place a little bit sooner than most people, but I do believe that it is inevitable, and it's like the birthright of humanity. And I think we're going through a rocky period because it is one of growth, and growth always comes with chaos and destruction of the old. So I do have a lot of hope that we're on the right path as a culture, and we're all waking up at our own pace and our own
Hmm.
speed, and but we're all on the journey, and we're all, these problems, because like it's like what Einstein said about problems cannot be solved in the level of consciousness that created them. That's exactly what we're talking about. Our problems are based The problems of the world are based on an old world consciousness. We fix them not by fixing them on the ground at the level at which they exist, but by raising our consciousness to the point where those problems are no longer relevant because we've
Yeah.
jumped to the next level of the video game.
Yeah. 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 And it's there's always an angle on what you're saying to be skeptical. Like I find myself like being like, yeah, but what about this? But what about that? But one thing that I think is undeniable that I've seen happen throughout my lifetime in a huge way is it becoming more accepted to be vulnerable. And if you're allowed to be vulnerable and speak your mind and talk openly about experiences that you've had, that's just like a springboard for evolution, for healing, for so many things to take place. And I really am. I do think that that's happening on a massive level. I still think there's plenty of people who are keeping the walls up, who are, you know, damaging themselves by holding on to certain constructs. But I also, for sure, on a collective level, see it like it's okay to hug, it's okay to cry, it's okay to talk about. I mean, even like look at like psychedelics, man. Psychedelics are essentially, they turn up the dial on the human experience to the maximum level, and we are beginning to accept those things as a whole. Like that in and of itself, I think, is an
Yeah.
incalculable cultural nuke that everybody's like, yeah, we should allow this back in. We should allow this come back into to
Yeah.
culture. And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
going to have huge effects.
look at Netflix. Like Netflix just put out the Michael Pollan psychedelic
Yeah.
series, and now it just put out the Graham Hancock Ancient Apocalypse series.
Yeah.
So these are things that were heavily repressed in not too long ago. And now they are featured series, high produced on the world's biggest streaming platform. If that's not an evolution of consciousness, I don't know what is. And you mentioned psychedelics. Also, last month I was at a men's retreat by a group called Sacred Sons.
Yeah.
Shout out my buddy Albert. And we were camping in the Appalachian Mountains. There were 400 men there, and it was all based around essentially, male intimacy and connection. And man, I saw a lot of men crying and being vulnerable and allowing themselves to show a side that they never do. And I'm talking about even like construction workers, like not like quote unquote spiritual men. And the willingness that I saw for men to be vulnerable was so touching. And it shows you what's possible when you kind of take out the social expectations and what's
Yeah.
naturally there when you remove the artificial kind of barriers and obligations that are imposed upon us. You see what's naturally there, and it's all heart and it's all love, and there's not toxic masculinity. It's actually in a different context. It becomes loving and protective and soft, right? So that for me, that was such a testament to where we're going as well.
Yeah.
The fact that this is not like a small group. This was like 400 men from all around the world that were coming to do this, and it's happening. Like things are changing, and people are ready for it.
Yeah, brother. Well, hey, this has been another really beautiful mind meld. I think that's such a beautiful note to end on, is like the undeniable evolution that is occurring. Like, these containers are being made, these spaces for growth, for getting into deeper touch with parts of yourself that have been off limits or haven't been celebrated. Like, you can find your group of evolutionary weirdos in this world now. Like, if there's a thing you're into, you can fucking find it, and that's pretty beautiful, man. And I think you're facilitating that for people too, because you're playing with novelty, you're encouraging novelty, you're dangling the novelty nuggets out in front of people for the consumption, and I think that's important.
You too, my man. I'm here for it. We're out here.
We are out here and in here.
And in here.